Culture Interrupted, produced by Cognitive Rise Productions. What is culture? How we observe and celebrate, how we care makes us a people upholding traditions built from our morals and experiences and values that we all have in common. Culture is how we share in the experience of life. Culture is how we celebrate life. What is happening in the cannabis industry? What are the changes and effects being felt? With regulation upon us, it is imperative that innovators remain compelling in action towards the ultimate goal, which is moving into a realm of highest quality standards and guidelines focused on wellness, harmony, education. Culture Interrupted is honored to present Amanda Reiman.
Well, currently I am the Vice President of Community Relations for Flocana. I'm also the Secretary of the International Cannabis Farmers Association and on the board of the California Cannabis Tourism Association. Culture is a very misunderstood and often underutilized part of the fabric that weaves us together. And I think it's an extremely important piece of all social movements, and in particular, ones that were spawned by marginalized groups of people. So when I was a PhD student, I did my doctoral dissertation on how medical cannabis dispensaries were operating as service providers, health service providers in the Bay Area. So in the summer of 2005, I spent about 6 weeks at dispensaries in San Francisco and in the Bay Area giving surveys to patients. And like we talk about culture, I was sitting in a dispensary for 8 hours a day, interacting with all the patients that came in and really seeing the impact that these dispensaries were having on their lives. And that to me was more beneficial than all of the conferences I've gone to, than all of the work I've done with the industry since, in really understanding what was the important part of this burgeoning industry. Like, what did we need to make sure we were not going to leave behind? Well, cannabis is extremely vulnerable to set and setting. Setting being the environment that you're in, and set being the mindset that you're in. And it's also very vulnerable to social suggestion. The sociologist Howard Becker did a very interesting study when he asked 60 new marijuana users about the first time they got high. And an urban legend that a lot of us hear is that for a lot of folks, they don't get high the first time. And that it actually takes social learning in order for people to really understand and benefit from cannabis. So that if folks are using without the knowledge of others, without the connection to others, that they're not able to fully understand and benefit from the plant. And we see that even mimicked in the chemistry of the cannabis plant. All of the cannabinoids working together have a much higher therapeutic value than any one cannabinoid isolated by itself. I think that right now, one of the struggles we're having and that we're really working towards is how do we take a very highly regulated system that is, the way California does business, and ensure that the pieces of the culture that were very important from the beginning are not lost in that process. And it is a constant struggle and it is a constant give and take. But I think that if we really want to benefit from legalization beyond just the legalization of cannabis, and what I mean is if we want to use this new access to cannabis to foster discussions about racism and gender disparity and economic disparity and environmental damage, then we need to preserve the parts of the cannabis culture like the social use, like the connection with the earth, because otherwise we're going to miss out on an opportunity to really make the most of this new access to the plant that's really unprecedented, that we haven't seen before. I really came to cannabis through the racial injustices of the drug war. That was my first piece of interest. I had read about things like the crack cocaine sentencing disparity laws, about mandatory minimums, about the fact that college students were denied funding because they had drug convictions. And so that's where my interest started. And as I started to do more research on that, I felt that cannabis was kind of this entree into talking about the harms of the drug war. It was a substance that many people had tried. It was the most frequently used illicit substance. It was a substance that more and more people felt shouldn't be illegal. And I felt this is an opportunity to meet people where they're at with a substance that they know, to say, hey, we're sitting here consuming cannabis. Isn't this great? Don't you know there's someone in jail for life just a few states away for doing this same thing? And, lo and behold, it really did become that catalyst to talk about the drug war. And now you're seeing all of these federal electeds talk about how socially unjust the drug war is, and that really spawned from the activism around cannabis. When Prop 215 was passed in 1996, it was on a half a piece of paper. All Prop 215 did was give you the right to use medical cannabis as a defense in court if your doctor had given you a recommendation. In 2002, Prop 420 was passed, which gave people the right to have dispensaries, and so we saw dispensaries start to form. But there was still no state rules around cannabis regulations for medical. The Senate Bill 420 directed the legislature to come up with these rules. But as we know in California, it's very difficult to get our elected officials to agree on anything. So continuously, year after year, bills would be introduced to introduce regulations into California, and they'd be knocked down again and again and again. Finally, in 2014, the legislature started to feel that legalization was on the horizon. It had happened in Colorado, then it happened in Oregon and Washington, and they thought, this is going to be our only chance to have any say in what these regulations look like. And lo and behold, after about 20 years of arguing, they came to an agreement and they passed the Medical Cannabis Safety and Regulation Act in 2015. That set the stage for what we see now. Prop 64 came along and sought to do a few things. One was to fill in some of the holes that were created by the medical regulations, to add the criminal sanction reductions, which weren't in the medical regulations at all. So reducing felonies to misdemeanors, reducing misdemeanors to infractions, letting people get their records expunged. None of that was covered in the medical regs. So Prop 64 kind of made it a more holistic policy and then said to the legislature, okay, now you have your marching orders. You have to make up rules for this. That is what we're seeing happen today. And I think it's really important for folks to understand the difference between legalization and regulation. So legalization just means this is no longer an illegal activity. And that is something that was very, very important because people were going to jail for cannabis and they were overwhelmingly poor people of color. So legalization was an absolute crucial step as it remains in all the states where cannabis is still prohibited. After legalization comes the question, okay, now that it's no longer a crime, how's it going to work as a business? And that's where the regulations stepped in. And those regulations are going to vary depending on the state you're in. Maine's regulations are going to look different than California's regulations. They're going to look different than Colorado's because all of our states regulate business differently. What we have going on here in California is a crash between the culture and the fact that California does business in a way that's almost a slap in the face to that very culture. And that is the rub.
You are listening to Culture Interrupted.
A proposition in a state like California requires a lot of give and take because we have such a heterogeneous population and we have extremely, extremely progressive areas and extremely, extremely conservative areas. So I understood that there was going to be a lot of compromise. You also had people like the unions and the police chiefs and the Rural Counties Association and the League of Cities, and they all wanted their rules injected into it as well. So I think that it was a very difficult task, but I think that we did it well. And I think at the end of the day, when you look at the social justice aspects that were addressed by Prop 64, that really was the first proposition to allow for records to be expunged, to protect people in the industry who had cannabis convictions, to set the stage for equity programs that would allow people that have been most impacted to get into the industry, to set aside funding for communities that have been most impacted. That was something we hadn't seen in any other state. And now that we did it, we have states coming after us that are looking to do the same thing. Massachusetts is looking at social equity programs. New York is looking at how to put social equity into their eventual legalization. So it was extremely important knowing that it wasn't going to be over after the election, that was really going to be just the beginning of the next stage, which has its own host of issues that we had to deal with. I work in the industry now, but I've always worked outside of the industry for nonprofit and academic entities. So I taught at Berkeley for 11 years in substance abuse treatment and drug and alcohol policy. I worked for the Berkeley Patients Group when it was a nonprofit cannabis dispensary as their director of patient services. And then I worked for the Drug Policy Alliance, which is a nonprofit that does drug policy reform. So for me, it was really always about the social justice aspect. I mean, that's why I became a social worker, because I felt that the profession of social work directs its social workers to fight against social injustice. And I felt like if I was going to have a job, I wanted it to be a job that was consistently fighting against these structural inequalities. When you think about how difficult it is to be a small business owner in the state of California, and you put on top of that how difficult it is to be a small agricultural business owner in the state of California, and then you put on top of that folks that have by design really avoided any kind of business practices or writing down what they're doing or keeping track of receipts by necessity, it creates a situation that is extremely challenging. And even though counties like Mendocino and Humboldt are indefinitely invested in trying to get people through the licensing process, the state admittedly is like, we're going through this the first time also. And so I think that, like being a pioneer in any industry, the folks that are out front definitely stand to win because they're the first ones, but they're also the ones that have to actually pave the road versus the people behind them that just get to walk down the road that's already been paved. But the farmers that we work with a lot of them have been gearing up for this for a while. You know, like I said, ever since at least they passed the medical regs in 2014, 2015, folks knew that the day was coming when they were going to have to be licensed by the state of California to continue doing what they were doing. And so at that point, even before Prop 64 language was released, a lot of farmers started to make business plans and think about building renovations and get water consultants to come out and talk to them about what they're doing. And those are the folks that now are like, yeah, this is difficult, but we're managing it. Versus folks who said, you know what, I'm just going to wait and see what happens. And now there's a lot of deadlines and people are trying to decide whether it's something they want to jump into at this point. Dispensaries have been regulated for a while. So for folks who had a dispensary that was licensed in the city of Oakland to become a state licensed dispensary, it wasn't that far of a reach. It wasn't that difficult to do. For folks that were manufacturing in their garages, and now the state is expecting them to be in a commercial manufacturing facility, that is definitely a lot more difficult. And no, I don't think they're getting the support they need, primarily because a lot of local economic development institutions are federally funded. So they're not allowed to work with cannabis businesses. They're not allowed to get small business loans. They're not allowed to work with banks. And so all of these things on top of the regulatory hurdles make it really difficult for the smaller producers to be successful.
You are listening to Culture Interrupted.
Alameda County does not have an equity program because I've been working with them on one. But I helped write the Oakland one, so I know a lot about that one. Oakland was the first place in the state to have an equity program. Right now they exist in Oakland and they exist in Los Angeles. A lot of this is predicated on people that were arrested by Oakland police for cannabis crimes and people who live in areas of Oakland that are highly policed for cannabis activity. That was really how that equity program started. It's a little bit of a different situation up here in Mendocino County. Most of the law enforcement has been federal, so it's not that we're seeing as much local law enforcement action like we do in other parts of the state. And we also do not have racial diversity up here. So looking at things like, you know, the overrepresentation of people of color in the criminal justice system, when you're 80% white, it's not exactly the same situation. So what Mendocino did instead is their feeling was that they needed to protect the people that were already cultivating here, and that was really their priority. Instead of new people coming in and competing with these folks, they wanted to give them the first opportunity to make it through the system. So what Mendocino did is that you cannot apply for a cultivation license until 2020 unless you can prove you were cultivating here prior to 2016. So everyone that is currently getting licensed for cultivation in Mendocino was already cultivating in Mendocino, and that was their way of giving the local folks a leg up. The optimistic part of me says, you know, cannabis consumers are like organic food consumers, and they care about where their cannabis comes from, and they care about who grows it, and they care about the impact of that cultivation on the earth, and they care about how the people who worked for that cultivator were treated, and that they will vote with their dollars, and they will gravitate towards brands like Flocana that represent that type of farmer community. I'm also optimistic that the number of women in the cannabis space and the fact that women and older folks are the fastest growing segments of the market will yield some very innovative, interesting, family-friendly, supportive, nurturing products that aren't just so stark and driven by like sexuality that we see when men are in charge. No offense. So I'm very excited about that. I'm on the board of an organization called The Initiative that's launching in Portland. It's a cannabis accelerator and incubator for female-founded cannabis businesses that gives them training in how to work the room, how to ask for money, how to navigate the cannabis space as a woman, and then gives them opportunities to pitch to a fund where they will be able to get funding. So we're having our first retreat in October in Oregon, and our feeling is that if we can empower women to make money and be successful in cannabis, it will filter down, because women, when they amass money, give it away to really worthwhile organizations. Men tend to keep it for their heirs. So we're really happy to see that opportunity. So I feel like if we can capitalize on those things, then cannabis has an opportunity to disrupt all of these other systems that we don't like: industrialized agriculture, big pharma, racial injustice in the criminal justice system. That's the optimistic side of me. The more realistic side of me says we live in a capitalist society, and money is what buys you success. And I see it happening already. And I see people getting into the industry that never would have set foot in the movement and be caught dead around those dirty hippies and their peace and love. But now that there's money to be made, including people that were against Prop 64, they're willing to throw their hat in the ring. And so my hope is that in this fight, good wins out over evil. But I think that's up to us. That's up to all of us, whether we're cannabis consumers and we're going to a dispensary, or we're cannabis advocates, or we're cannabis business leaders. We get to decide. The cement is not dry. We get to decide what the future of this industry looks like. Look at wine. I think it's a really good comparison. So you have your $2 chuck.
You are listening to Culture Interrupted.
And then you have your Opus One, right? You have your, this is the wine for the super special occasion when I really want to impress someone. And then you have everything in between. And so I think it's going to be no different with cannabis. When we start having the geographical indicators so people know where it's produced, when we start looking at appellation development so folks know that they're getting a very unique strain from a very unique growing region in California, we will absolutely see differentiation. I don't think it's going to be a complete commodities market. I think there will be a specialized market as well, just like we see with craft liquor, beer, and wine. So I think the illicit market is definitely dissipating, and really a lot of that is because it is so difficult to get a license that once people have a license, they don't want to work with any unlicensed people in the supply chain because they're worried that it's going to put their license in jeopardy. So if you're somebody that has a licensed dispensary and you spent a lot of money and time to get that license, and someone that doesn't have a license is trying to sell you product, you're most likely not going to take it because there's plenty of licensed people to sell it to you, and you don't want to lose your license. So I do think we'll see less and less in the illicit market. We are seeing youth cannabis use drop, so we are not seeing them kind of pick up the illicit market. So I do think we'll see a disruption there. One of the few felonies that remains is growing cannabis on public lands and in national forests. And so I think we'll start to see eradication of those grows, which tend to be related to drug organizations. It's the compassion and it's the willingness to accept and respect people that are different. And that was really something that struck me in my early research on cannabis dispensaries. You know, medical cannabis was born out of the HIV crisis in San Francisco in the 1980s. It was really championed by the LGBTQ population, and it was really centered around bringing comfort, relief, and social connection to people that were being isolated. And so the early dispensaries really focused on making everyone feel welcome. And I think that one of the things about cannabis being such a social substance is that it makes people see each other, for real see each other. And I really hope we keep that. And I think it's actually one of the reasons the federal government is so afraid of cannabis, because I think it breaks down walls, whereas other drugs tend to put them up. And I think they don't like that. I'm really excited to see where social consumption and events go with cannabis, as well as tourism. I think we have an opportunity right now to really expose people to what we love so much about this plant, and with that comes a great responsibility. And in my mind, we will have folks from Nebraska and Kansas and Louisiana coming to California to visit farms and to try cannabis and to experience the culture. And we want them to return saying, this was amazing. Like, we have to have this here. We need to change our laws. We don't want them to return saying, I overdosed on a brownie in my hotel room by myself and it was the worst thing that ever happened. So I think that even though folks tend to be afraid of social consumption and the idea of creating spaces for people to use cannabis out in public, I do believe it's going to be a really key piece to how this industry and this movement helps maintain the culture. Well, I mean, the Bureau of Cannabis Control is probably most influential at this point because they're the ones that hold the licenses. But before we even had regulation, it was really the consumer that was demanding more knowledge about their product. It wasn't that long ago that dispensaries had a brownie wrapped in cellophane with no label, no knowledge of what was in it or how strong it was. And they started testing product before it was required by the state. And it was patients who were coming in and saying, look, I can't just take any brownie. I need to know what this is going to do to me. So we started to see labels change. We started to see ingredients put on labels. We started to see healthier edibles. You know, it was so sugar laden for so long. That was a direct response to consumers saying, I care about what I put in my body. And see, that's where I get my optimism that these consumers are going to go the right direction, that they're going to go towards the sun-grown products, the organic products, the small family farm products, because they've always showed us that they're that kind of conscientious consumer.
You are listening to Culture Interrupted.
You see these very, very large industrial-sized indoor grow operations that are popping up. Not only do we not know if the market needs that much production, but it's the mass production of a very sensitive and sophisticated plant. The farmers that we work with who grow cannabis in the sun, they know each individual plant. They develop that relationship. They try to bring other elements of nature into that garden to enhance the expression of that cannabis plant. It's such a far cry from row after row after row of plants under high intensity discharge lighting, which is a ton of electricity to add to the grid and doesn't take advantage of the fact that cannabis is a plant and does best when it has that connection with the sun, the earth, the moon, and the air. Well, I think we're going to have a whole host of novel cannabinoids come on the market. I mean, there's over 80 cannabinoids in the plant, and we focus so much on CBD and THC. So my prediction is that we're going to see THCV really come into play. So THCV is a very interesting cannabinoid. It's actually an appetite suppressant, but it has some of the same euphoric effects as THC. So I think that's going to be very interesting, especially among the very health conscious market. I think we're also looking at things like CBN, which is pretty much what happens to THC when it gets really old. It's why when you find like a super, super old joint and you smoke it, it puts you right to sleep because the THC has now become CBN. So I think in terms of looking at sleep aids and other things for people who are on sleep medications, that's really what we're going to see come through are these novel cannabinoids. And then I also think we're going to see more alternatives to smoking. Now, me personally, I'm a flowers girl. I like to smoke pot, but I do know that other people may not like smoking or they may live in a place where smoking isn't appropriate. So we've seen a huge rise in vape pens, but I think we're going to see even more ways for people to ingest cannabis, perhaps through an inhaler or more skin patches transdermally. So I think that that's something also exciting that will come on the market. I have a lot of respect for this plant, and I feel like the plant is telling us how it wants to be. It's telling us how it wants to grow. It's telling us how it wants to interact with people. It's telling us the best way to partner with it to get the changes that we want. And I think if we listen, and again, I go back to the women and how much more in tune they are with these types of things. And I think they're better able to be messengers for what the plant wants than really focusing on the business of the plant. And so while I understand the need to have business because you need to be able to stay afloat, I always come back to the stories and the connections because I feel like when we look back, if we don't let that guide us, we're going to see this as a huge missed opportunity and things aren't going to change. I have been thinking, and I've been asked, if there's one thing you could change about Prop 64, what would it be? And I think it's kind of a boring answer, but we did not categorize the size of cultivation correctly in Prop 64. We categorized it by square footage. And when you look at the license types for cultivation, they're categorized by square footage. When you look at the fee schedules, they're categorized by square footage. We did not take into account that not everybody grows this plant seasonally. and that the amount of cannabis that can be produced from an indoor grow with 6 harvests a year is way more than the cannabis that's going to be produced in the same square footage for somebody who's a seasonal farmer. So if I had to go back, I would make it all based on production level. I would say how much you pay, what you have to do is all based on how much you're producing per year, not how big your plot is. And I think we just didn't know. We didn't think about the fact that this was much more of a two-dimensional issue. We thought of it more as just the size of a field, like any other crop, but this isn't any other crop because prohibition has driven it inside. So if I had to go back, I would make things based on production value versus square footage. But we're working on that, and hopefully we'll be able to fix that. So I would like to really underscore the importance of maintaining the culture by having people have direct connection with the farmers. I think this is very, very important. And when we talk about maintaining that connection of culture and of social use and of the full circle of cannabis as a plant, we need to include the farmer. And so when I see a patient meet a farmer who grew their medicine, it is an extremely important moment. And I think we should all be looking at more ways to involve consumers with the producers. And that, I think, is really going to help cement the culture because that's what the farmers have. They have the culture. They are the keepers of the culture right now. And so the more we can expose them to the new consumer, the better.
We appreciate you making the time to listen to Culture Interrupted.